This month, I attended the annual convening of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And during breakfast, I sat with a resident of Northampton County, North Carolina, who expressed concerns about the build-out of a solar farm in her community. I have to admit that in the back of my mind, I was thinking, come on, we need to evolve our energy economy, and what's the big deal? I quickly learned about the big deal. She talked about the ecological impacts associated with the cutting down of trees and what was being lost in terms of natural carbon sequestration. She talked about the loss of natural habitats for animals and how bears regularly appear in spaces where children normally play. She talked about community and family quality of life issues because parents no longer consider their front yards to be safe spaces for their children. She talked about there being a 4-month gap between the time when the community heard about a 560-acre solar farm and when local officials were aware. Finally, she talked about air quality issues associated with how waste from the build-out of these solar projects were being handled and how it didn't align with agreed-upon protocols. This may or may not be an extreme example of what happens when we leap before we look, as the permitting process is designed to do. But what it does give us is an opportunity to think about what it means to build big and fast as we solve the problems of creating affordable and resilient housing, getting more clean and reliable energy on the grid, improving our infrastructure in a myriad of ways, including our water systems and our roadways, training up current and future generations to maximize economic opportunities and community benefits, and to generally make life in this country more affordable. Regulations are designed to align private behavior with the public interest by setting standards, prohibiting harmful activities, and assigning consequences for non-compliance. And so what does it mean to embrace a political and policy agenda that calls for the opposite, for relaxing and eliminating the rules? Who will be most impacted? My name is Dana Johnson, and I am the founder of Strategic Movement Collective, and we leverage our expertise in public policy, advocacy, and organizational capacity to support movements advancing justice and equity. Today, I am honored to partner with We Act for Environmental Justice to host this important conversation. I have the privilege of working with Peggy Shepard and being a part of the federal policy team for more than 5 years, and I am excited to share space with them today. During this webinar, you will hear from Hannah of the Revolving Door Project. She will ground us in the abundance agenda. What is it? Who are the players? And where does the money come from? Then you'll hear from AJ of We Act, who will share a recent story map that the organization completed around the National Environmental Policy Act, and he'll share their thoughts on the abundance agenda. Next, you'll hear from Erik of the Western Environmental Law Center, who will talk about mission clarity when it comes to permitting. And before we take your questions, you'll hear from Alvaro, who will share his thoughts on a slightly different take on abundance that can get us to the same goal. As we transition to our first presenter, I want you to keep this idea in mind. There is no disconnect between abundance and environmental justice. Environmental justice calls for the promotion of economic alternatives, which can contribute to the development of environmentally safe communities, livelihoods, and health. It's also a pathway to securing our political, economic, and cultural liberation. That resonates like abundance. Hannah, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. As Dana said, I'm Hannah. I'm Deputy Research Director at the Revolving Door Project, where I focus on how industry influences the federal government, largely on climate and environmental issues. There's so much to say on this topic, and some really excellent speakers coming after me. So in the interest of time, I would love to dive right into it. So, as you all probably know, the Abundance Agenda was popularized earlier this year by the book Abundance by opinion journalists Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. And forgive me if I start coughing at any point. I'll do my best to speak through my sore throat. So there are a few other books that also share the abundance thesis, including Why Nothing Works by Mark Dunkelman, which is pictured here. And I think it's important to note that prior to the mainstreaming of the term abundance earlier this year by these books, a substantial ecosystem of abundance think tanks, funders, and proponents already existed. This ecosystem includes dozens of center-left and right-wing think tanks uniting around the abundance framework, and at this point, well over $100 million being poured into it by funders. The two resources that I have here on the right are from my organization, Revolving Door Project. The first is a joint report with Open Markets Institute scrutinizing the abundance agenda. And the second is a tool that I'm sure you don't have details to be able to see here, mapping the key players in this coalescing abundance movement. My hope is that by the end of my conversation here, you'll understand that abundance isn't an idea that gained sort of organic traction in this disorderly political moment, so much as an organized, well-funded, and ideologically complicated political faction that's positioning itself right now as the alternative to a more unapologetically populist agenda. But I do want to say up front, as Dana expressed earlier, that there's no inherent reason why an abundance agenda for public goods, for the public interest, couldn't be paired with an accountability agenda for the corporations that perpetuate injustice. It just hasn't been so far. And largely because I think the proponents of abundance tend to view their agenda as a course correction from a more justice-oriented politics of redistribution. So with that, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Before I get into the text on this slide, I should give you a little overview of the basic thesis of the book Abundance, which is that the scarcity and expensiveness of essential goods, including things like clean energy and affordable housing, stems from an overly restrictive and decentralized regulatory regime that creates too many, quote, veto points to build and produce what we need at speed and scale. It is largely a deregulatory platform, but packaged by Klein and Thompson to answer left-wing concerns about, among other things, the speed of decarbonization. But it's gained plenty of friends on the right as well, who see abundance as a chance for a bipartisan deregulatory agenda that also benefits fossil fuels. I won't say more on housing here, just in the interest of time, except to note that I think part of what's troubling to me about the abundance agenda is that it prescribes the same fix, eliminating veto points from permitting processes across considerably different policy areas. Weakening the environmental review process for energy infrastructure at the federal level is really quite different from city-level zoning reform to expedite affordable housing. I think these are separate issues, and I think they deserve their own precise and targeted interventions. For the folks that remember how the permitting reform conversation developed over the past few years, I think you have a shortcut for understanding where abundance positions itself on energy issues. I think a key moment to remember is the way that environmental and local groups were vocally opposed to the fracked gas pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And at that point, many of the high-profile pundits aligned with Abundance were urging Congress to approve this pipeline in order to get a deal done with Senator Manchin. Abundance advocates are generally quite critical of environmentalists and dismissive of environmental justice as a priority. And this is because they view environmentalists as more interested in blocking bad projects than supporting good ones. But I think it's important for us all to recognize that you need to both block and build if you want to have a clean energy transition. So this slide has excerpts from my book review of abundance that came out earlier this spring. I think I would tend to be a little bit more succinct in writing than speaking, so including that here. I critique what I see as this book's sort of abundance of credulity that the private sector would respond to fewer checks on its activities by providing socially necessary goods. We know that corporations are willing to sacrifice communities for profit, and that every bright line that corporations don't cross was hard won by people organizing. So fundamentally, my critique of abundance is that it shies away from a realistic understanding of power, and it's consequently easy to co-opt by powerful actors. Elon Musk earlier this year highlighted Ezra Klein's factually inaccurate criticisms of Biden's investment in broadband infrastructure to justify Doge and to suggest that public funds for broadband should be rerouted to Musk's Starlink instead. Derek Thompson called oligarchs the adults in the room on CNN during his abundance press tour and said that we need them to step in to stop authoritarianism. I think, needless to say, it is not the oligarchs that are going to protect the power of people. And that credulity about powerful interests is what makes the abundance agenda a challenging fit, in my view, for our political reality. Next slide, please. So very quickly, this slide shows an interactive diagram my colleague Henry put together, exploring some of the connections between the different players in the abundance movement. I wish we could explore this tool during the presentation, but we cannot. So I will just share the link to it afterwards for anyone who wants to check it out. And the main thing to note here is that there's a lot of ideological variance within the abundance movement. There's liberals like Klein and Thompson, there's libertarian organizations like the Mercatus Center and the Niskanen Center, and there's conservative institutions like the Foundation for American Innovation and American Enterprise Institute. But I do want to talk a bit more about the money behind the abundance agenda, which I will do with our next slide. So what we're seeing right now is that the rapid build-out of AI data centers is increasing demand for gas and coal-fired power plants. Tech and fossil fuel companies want to eliminate regulatory obstacles to a very energy-intensive vision of rapid AI build-out, which is setting back the pace of the energy transition in favor of energy addition and creating or worsening sacrifice zones around the country. I think some of the panelists that follow me are going to explore these examples in more detail, but this is a dynamic that we see at play with the polluting XAI facility in Memphis, with new gas plants being built for Meta's $10 billion AI facility in Louisiana, and in many other communities. And as you can see from the slide, most of the sponsors of this year's Abundance Conference in DC have connections to either the fossil fuel industry or the tech industry. We also have several abundance organizations that get their money from the Koch network. And Open Philanthropy, which is one of the organizations here, is investing $120 million in an abundance and growth agenda this year, with money from the co-founders of Facebook and Stripe. So that's why I think it's worth asking what the abundance framework offers the fossil fuel and tech industries. And I think the answer is becoming increasingly clear. Several abundance groups, including Chamber for Progress and the Foundation for American Innovation, have urged Trump's White House to further limit NEPA for energy projects that support AI infrastructure, which the White House is already pursuing. The Trump administration has taken enormous amounts of money from these industries and is now working to tilt the playing field further in their favor, which leads us to our next slide. Thank you. So the Trump administration's abundance agenda. I want to point out that the Trump's energy and natural resources appointees, folks like Chris Wright, Lee Zeldin, Doug Burgum, have been using energy abundance rhetoric to justify their pro-fossil fuel agenda. Trump has bragged about, quote, delivering historic permitting wins by weakening NEPA and passing his Unleashing American Energy executive order, which fast-tracks permitting for fossil fuel infrastructure. Trump also signed an executive order accelerating permitting for AI data centers that are specifically powered by fossil fuels. So the stated priorities of the abundance agenda, which are streamlining bureaucratic processes, cutting red tape, do sound a lot like the rhetoric that DOGE has used to justify slashing agencies' capacity. And I think all of this poses a significant challenge to anyone using the rhetoric of abundance as a way to distinguish their political platform from our current administration. Instead, I would suggest that an affirmative vision of an energetic government that's capable of solving problems and willing to make powerful enemies in order to protect the public interest would do more to fill the growing void between this government's actions and the public's needs. Last slide, please. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what I view as the dangers of an abundance of credulity. One thing that Klein and Thompson lament in their book is the lack of trust in government. They see that the bedrock procedural laws we've passed since the 70s, laws including NEPA, but also more substantive laws, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, as a manifestation of distrust in government to do big things, and argue that the consequent inability of government to do big things increases that distrust. I think we can agree that we need a government that's motivated and empowered and capable of acting without determining that the solution is then to eliminate imperfect processes like public comment periods, like community engagement, like judicial review and public interest lawsuits that have historically and currently allowed communities to have some say in very opaque but important processes. Under Trump, the balance of power continues to tip sharply in favor of elite corruption and corporate profiteering. And we need an opposition party with an answer to that. But I think that that answer can't prioritize speed of change over direction of change. So many of our interconnected problems right now were born from prioritizing expediency and profit in the first place. And I think we won't solve them without a commitment to just outcomes that matches the speed of action. So with that, thank you for, for letting me talk.
Yes, thank you, Hannah. AJ, we'll turn to you.
Thank you, Dana. And hi, everyone. My name is AJ Yuan. I'm the legislative coordinator at We Act for Environmental Justice in our Washington, D.C. office. I know I introduced We Act previously, but just to briefly reintroduce ourselves, We Act is a membership-based organization rooted in West Harlem in New York City. For decades, we've been working to make sure that people of color and people of low income can participate fully and meaningfully in environmental policy decision-making. We've been active in the New York State and New York City levels, and since 2012, we've been doing the same at the federal level here in DC. So today I'll be talking about how the abundance agenda or deregulatory agenda, as we at We Act have been framing it, can impact environmental justice communities and how it threatens to possibly worsen existing harms and burdens that EJ communities already face. I do want to take the time to reintroduce what environmental justice is, given that over the past few years, there's been a concerted effort to politicize and distort what this movement stands for and what EJ communities have been fighting for. So for decades now, people of color and of low income in this country have been suffering disproportionately worse impacts from pollution, hazardous waste, toxic materials, as well as climate change and natural disasters. This is called environmental racism or environmental injustice, and it's due to a history of racist laws and policies in this country. Next slide, please. Because of environmental racism, people of color and working class people have higher rates of cancer, respiratory illness, cardiovascular disease, as well as higher rates of premature death. And fighting for environmental justice is not asking for special treatment. In reality, EJ communities are fighting to protect their lives and the health and safety of their neighborhoods and their homes. Next slide, please. What proponents of deregulation forget or intentionally ignore is that while we did used to build fast in this country, it often came at the cost of communities, especially those most politically vulnerable or already facing discrimination. In 1956, 14 years before the passage of NEPA, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act, which authorized $25 billion to construct 41 miles of interstate highways. This was before any kind of environmental review or public participation requirements. And so city planners intentionally selected Black communities with lower property values for highway construction. Neighborhoods were literally split apart by highways. Homes and businesses were seized through eminent domain. Some neighborhoods were entirely demolished. And in some cases, urban planners intentionally used the highway to segregate neighborhoods, consistent with redlining, racial segregation, and Jim Crow policies of the time. A study from the Department of Transportation estimates that over 475,000 homes and 1 million people were displaced between 1957 and 1977 as part of highway expansion. So not only did these highway constructions ruin neighborhoods' economic development, but these highways delivered enormous amounts of air pollution from transportation emissions. And today, these communities are still facing this pollution burden, but its effects have been compounded with the construction of transportation hubs such as ports and warehouses. Next slide, please. So I'm sure that a lot of folks on this call live in Washington, D.C. or in the surrounding areas. So this highway expansion almost happened in our town. In 1968, the city of D.C. proposed building a 10-lane freeway that would have cut off the predominantly Black Brooklyn, Shaw, and U Street corridor neighborhoods from the rest of the city. However, communities in D.C. stood up for their homes. They protested, picketed, petitioned, and organized as part of a broader freeway revolt movement. And these freeway revolts directly led to the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act, otherwise known as NEPA, in 1970. So the reason why we have the environmental regulations that we have today is to protect our communities from the racism and violence they faced in the past. Next slide, please. So I want to highlight two examples of projects that demonstrate how these bedrock environmental regulations can directly lead to the successful build-out of transportation and clean energy projects. These examples directly undercut the narrative that deregulatory proponents are trying to push, that environmental regulations slow down progress. And these examples can be found in a recent story map that was published by WeAct called NEPA Does Not Delay. So the first project I want to highlight is the 10 Westlink transmission line. This is a 125-mile transmission project running through Arizona and California. Currently, it's delivering 3,000 megawatts of electricity to the region, which is enough energy for 300,000 homes. The original plan for this line, however, would have cut through traditional land for indigenous tribes in the region, as well as the Kofa National Wildlife Refuge, which is a crucial habitat for endangered species. Community members raised concerns that the line would also threaten tourism, which is a critical industry for local residents, including local tribes. Through the NEPA process, community members and tribal historical preservation offices were able to work together with elected officials and developers. And developers ended up selecting an alternative route for the route, which would have utilized existing utility corridors and routes parallel to existing infrastructure. The revised route lowered overall project timelines and costs, and most importantly, since the revised project addressed community concerns, environmental groups that originally opposed the project later provided letters of support. Next slide, please. The second project I want to highlight is the Los Angeles County Metro's Crenshaw LAX Transit Corridor project. So this is an 8.5-mile light rail extension that connects Crenshaw, Englewood, and LAX to the region's broader metro system. And it's designed to address historical transportation inequities for predominantly Black and Brown Southern LA residents. So the project's initial proposal raised concerns that it would, like historical highway expansion, cut through neighborhoods and disrupt local businesses. However, through NEPA, the LA Metro was able to identify an existing 5-mile freight rail line corridor that they were able to build out. Local officials similarly ensured that the project was built with extensive community input. Local residents held over 60 meetings to develop community recommendations, and these recommendations ensured that economic benefits from the project would be reinvested into local businesses, that local residents would make up the workforce for the line's construction, and that part of the construction would also include an open-air museum called Destination Crenshaw, which is a series of interconnected green spaces that promote local culture, art, and businesses. So all these projects are strong, positive examples of how regulations can benefit both communities and developers. I also want to take the time to highlight a timely example of what happens when current regulations are ignored and developers instead adopt a deregulatory, build fast, break things mindset. Next slide, please. So XAI, an artificial intelligence company associated with X, formerly known as Twitter, began operating a large-scale data center in South Memphis last year, specifically in the predominantly Black neighborhood of Boxtown. Boxtown is an already overburdened environmental justice community. It's home to 17 polluting industrial facilities, and as a result has a cancer rate that's 4 times the national average. Shelby County, where Boxtown is located, has the highest rate of asthma in all of Tennessee. To power the facility, XAI installed 35 methane gas turbines, which is estimated to emit 1,200 to 2,000 tons of nitrogen oxide air pollution per year. Before August 2025, XAI didn't actually have any Clean Air Act permits. Furthermore, none of the 35 methane gas turbines on site were equipped with pollution controls typically required by federal rules. To purposely bypass the regulatory requirements, XAI put their turbines on wheels so that they could classify as temporary pollution sources. Residents didn't even know how many of the generators existed. Only after advocates flew drones equipped with cameras over the facility were they able to identify all 35 generators. What's happening in Memphis is happening across the country. Tech companies are using underhanded tactics to intentionally place AI data centers in environmental justice communities, Black communities, working class communities, places where people are already overburdened, underinvested, disenfranchised, and politically vulnerable. Just like in highway expansion, these communities are being targeted. However, this time developers are also violating regulatory requirements that now exist to protect our neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So environmental regulations exist for a reason. They are to address decades, if not centuries, of this country sacrificing the health and safety and lives of Black and brown people, people of color, and working class people to build projects that benefit everyone else, from the Transcontinental Railroad to the build out of the nation's agricultural system, to highway expansion, and most recently to the build out of fossil fuel infrastructure. What deregulatory proponents claim, that regulatory processes are slowing down development, is, in my opinion, naive, simplistic, reckless, and honestly thoughtless. And it's a thoughtless way of looking at our country's current clean energy issues. Deregulatory proponents conveniently ignore the fact that under the current administration, with support from the fossil fuel lobby, clean energy projects have come under a full-scale attack. Permits have been reversed. Critical funding has been unlawfully cut. Environmental justice communities like the one in Cancer Alley, Louisiana, they face every stage of the fossil fuel life cycle, from extraction to refinement to consumption. So, of course, the clean energy transition is a critical policy priority for EJ communities. So is affordable housing, so is public transportation. But what EJ communities and organizations are opposed to is a build out of these projects that continue coming at the cost of communities and of color and working class communities. So in fact, our NEPA Does Not Delay story map highlights proven solutions that EJ organizations support that actually work to speed up projects as opposed to deregulation. Strengthening public participation and community engagement, as examples I highlighted demonstrate, increasing staffing and funding for regulatory administration and implementation, increasing interagency and intergovernmental coordination, and also addressing challenges in transmission and clean energy build out directly, rather as part of a political negotiation, such as through permitting reform. For those of us who work in or are adjacent to the environmental justice movement, we know that the work that we do at the end of the day is accountable to environmental justice communities. Currently, I don't see that kind of accountability from proponents of abundance. As these abundance proponents continue developing their policies, I hope that they make a concerted effort to acknowledge and confront the racist and violent history of our country's past, as well as the abundance of pollution that communities face today. These things are all what environmental regulations are designed to address. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Dana. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, AJ. Erik.
Hey folks, my name is Erik Schlenker-Goodrich. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Environmental Law Center. I live in northern New Mexico in the town of Taos. First slide, please. Or next slide. Yeah, there, thank you. First, I want to thank the Strategic Movement Collective and We Act for Justice for organizing this panel and for the presentations by Hannah and AJ. I think they really set the stage for what I'm going to say. When I think about abundance, what I am struck by is a poverty of thinking about what is involved in actually achieving true abundance for people and for the world. This is an image crafted by Kate Raworth in her book, Donut Economics, which I think is fantastic. And I'd encourage folks to read it about how we change our economic and political systems. And what it basically says is that for us to have true abundance, we need to live within this safe space, which is setting a social foundation and an ecological ceiling that allows us to thrive. It reminds me of a saying attributed to Reinhold Niebuhr about freedom is a recognition of limitations. And it's through recognizing that we live on a finite planet and that we have relationships with each other and the world around us, what we at the Western Environmental Law Center refer to as an ecology of kinship. That's how we thrive. That's how we find true abundance. And the problem with abundance in terms of how Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson and others have framed it is that it really fixates on a few of these components. With climate change, it focuses on greenhouse gas reductions to the exclusion of thinking about adaptation and resilience. It criticizes issues such as environmental justice, issues such as social equity, the political voice of people as everything but the bagel liberalism. The Roosevelt Institute yesterday issued a fantastic report where they had interviews with, I believe it was 45 former Biden-Harris administration senior officials. And I will concur with the assessment of one senior official at the Department of Commerce, which said that the critique of everything but the bagel liberalism is bullshit, quote unquote. So, when we think about how we are going to promote true abundance, and I saw several comments talking about the origins of abundance in the Q&A, that it has essentially been co-opted. I couldn't agree with that more. And that we need to find true abundance by recognizing that we live on a planet where we need to address things, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but adaptation and resilience, air pollution, biodiversity loss, ecological protection, ocean acidification, et cetera, while also protecting the basic foundation for what it means to be a thriving, abundant society. Next slide, please. Abundance, of course, is showing up in policymaking, in particular in Congress. And here with permitting reform, I want to make a distinction between what is occurring at the federal level with what is occurring at the state and local level. There are a variety of very good permitting reform ideas that are out there, and I know state and local jurisdictions are looking at it. At the federal level, permitting reform is really co-opted by the fossil fuel industry. And so when we look at bills that are percolating through Congress now, and in particular, I'm going to focus here on the SPEED Act, HR 4776, which is in the House of Representatives. It has moved out of committee. We are expecting it to move to the House floor whenever the House reconvenes, if it does, in fact, at some juncture reconvene. And the SPEED Act really illustrates how the abundance movement is not only a reductionist approach that evidences a poverty thinking about what true abundance is, but it's also a co-option or an incorporation of what the fossil fuel industry is saying. And now what we're seeing, an emergent alliance between the big tech industry and the fossil fuel industry in terms of basically allowing us to build anything everywhere all at once. And this approach, we think, is extraordinarily misguided. First key point here is that the United States Supreme Court, as well as the Trump administration, has unraveled bedrock environmental protections that protect people and place. The permitting reform agenda seems to largely oblivious to this, or to the degree it's not oblivious, is really taking advantage of that chaos sowed by the Supreme Court and the Trump administration, which would make all of us think twice about what the true motives are behind the abundance movement. And we know folks who are dealing with this federal legislation, that Hill offices are being flooded by lobbyists, both by the fossil fuel industry and by the abundance movement and by big tech. We're getting run over right now. We are getting bulldozed. And they are blaming bedrock environmental laws that, as AJ was talking about, have been essential to protect and safeguard communities, in particular voice and their access to planning and decision-making processes that affect their lives. And much of the abundance movement, when we think about how they are approaching this, they're advocating and thinking about centrist perspectives on this that are emerging, thinking of folks like Matthew Iglesias on the pundit sphere, who is frankly obnoxious and is very influential, unfortunately. And they are promoting these all of the above technology neutral approaches. This sounds attractive, but it's deceptive, because when you hear all of the above, when you hear technology neutral, I would urge folks to think this means fossil fuels. This means handing over the keys to the kingdom to the technology industry, to big tech, to AI, to data centers. I am shocked by how many communities, how many groups that we are engaging with are dealing with issues like what is occurring in Memphis, where AI data centers aligning with fossil fuels, harming communities. Getting rid of bedrock laws prevents us from holding these entities accountable. I'm not going to get into too many of the details with the SPEED Act itself. I'd encourage folks to advocate in opposition of the SPEED Act, to raise their voices. Again, the lobbying for this bill is extraordinarily intensive. We are deeply concerned that there will be legislation coming out of this that may be some kind of omnibus legislation that packages together provisions of the SPEED Act along with provisions for other laws, proposed legislation that are percolating in Congress. Senator Whitehouse, who is usually a champion for our movement, is actively engaged in negotiations. This makes no sense to us. Our basic perspective is not only are these individual bills that are now percolating terrible, but the political moment we are finding ourselves in will inevitably lead to a dead end for us all. And so the idea of taking up permitting reform in this fraught political moment is not a particularly smart one. It will leave us worse off. We simply cannot trust Congress right now, and in particular the Trump administration, to honor any agreement that is made by legislators, including agreements made by legislators who are typically the champions of the issues that we very much care for. Now, with this abundance framework, I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about where my organization, the Western Environmental Law Center, sees things going. Next slide, please. I want to infuse people with a sense of possibility. And I want to start with the notion that, in the words of Dougal Hine, we are at work in the ruins of American democracy. And that is, at one level, terrifying. And at one level, I think it is a pragmatic recognition that leads to a sense of liberation and a sense of possibility. And that's what brings up the quote by N.K. Jemisin. She's a science fiction author. She won the Hugo Award for her trilogy, the Broken Earth trilogy, which is fantastic. I'd encourage folks to read it. And when she accepted that award, she had this line in it involving writers, but I think is applicable to those of us in this movement to secure climate action that is rooted in ecological protection and environmental justice. The notion that we are creators and we are the engineers of possibility. And even as we do this work in the ruins, that conversations like today allow us to connect together, to network, to form, in the words of Ilya Prigozhin, who was a Nobel Prize winning chemist, whose ideas about unraveling of systems actually leads to the regeneration and the revitalization of systems through small islands of coherence. Folks, on this conversation, we are one of those islands of coherence, and we can build from that. And much of this may seem impossible. You know, I picked up my kid yesterday to take into a doctor's appointment and spoke with the principal and was acutely conscious that many of the families in my school are going to be dealing with food insecurity issues because of the ending of SNAP benefits, are going to be dealing with immense healthcare issues because of the elimination of ACA subsidies. And so all of that is present. But at the same time, if we take forward steps towards that sense of liberation, that sense of possibility, that way, in the words of Rumi, will appear. And as some of our staff have said internally at the Western Environmental Law Center, paths are created by many footsteps. In other words, as we work together, as we network together, we can create that sense of possibility. We can turn that into reality. So let me get into a couple of the ideas and the core areas that we think are essential to true abundance. Next slide, please. So we've identified a couple of core strategies and overarching themes for what we think involves true abundance and a revitalization of the domain of bedrock environmental law, in particular, revitalizing bedrock environmental law to better account for people and communities and the concept of environmental justice. The first goes to that notion, Dougal Hine notions of work in the ruins, that what we are witnessing now is the end of systems of politics, of governance, of economics that are now in their dying phase. And that what we need to do is to rapidly and swiftly transition away from this extractive economy towards a living economy. So that's the first basic notion, sort of an overarching directionality of where we want to go. Hannah mentioned the idea of direction over speed. I could not agree with that more. The second is an eco-regional framework. And by eco-regional, we mean looking at specific places and driving change from the bottom up, from the place and community level, where we can really look at that intersection of climate, ecological, and community values to thread together that true abundance, that everything but the bagel liberalism, everybody loves an everything bagel, and to really tie that complexity together, recognizing that abundance is complexity. Abundance is protection of that complexity and the relationship between all those different elements, the ecology of kinship. The third area is the third, fourth, and fifth areas really encapsulates my critique, the Western environmental laws critique of the entire attack on process-oriented laws and bedrock environmental laws writ large. They argue this sclerosis of process, and the solution being get rid of these bedrock environmental laws that perhaps once had a purpose but no longer serve that purpose. Again, I think that's bullshit. I think if we're going to address the process concerns that are legitimate in many respects, the better solution is as follows. First, we need to clarify agency missions. Most agency missions are extraordinarily vague. They essentially they're essentially an abdication of the responsibility of Congress and the executive branch to determine what is our direction as a country, to leave those questions to be answered by markets that are rigged against us. So to the degree we can clarify missions, and I think of in the public lands context where agencies like the Bureau of Land Management have a multiple use mission that is essentially allow anything, anywhere, depending on whoever applies, whenever they apply. It means nothing. It is mud. And so clarify those agency missions, and that has downstream effects that then clarify the processes that governments are engaging in, allowing them to prioritize what they're going to do. Second key prong is to strengthen government capacity, making sure that federal agencies have the ability to actually work through and address the public's concerns underneath the rubric of a very clear and directive mission. And the third area is on the public participation side of the equation. And I want to settle here for a little bit and talk about this, because notice and comment rulemaking, and I suspect many of the folks in this meeting have gone through it, it kind of sucks. And we need to move beyond notice and comment rulemaking, considering issues of participatory governments and democracy, infusing that into the process. And when you think about the solution that is being proffered by Abundance and by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, I'm not sure really what the solution is. Is it to simply allow corporate developers and technocrats to make decisions for the people? Because that's what it seems to be, from my perspective, where they criticize everyone who opposes development as a NIMBY. NIMBYism is a real problem. We're not NIMBYs here. We're here to protect the public interest. My group, my organization, that's what we do. So conflating the idea of NIMBYs with those who are simply skeptical of development at all costs, and rightly so, I think that's a problem, and I think it's a tell. And when you look at the literature, the political science and social science literature, you find, and for organizers on the ground, I suspect this is just basic instinct embedded into your DNA and your bones. It's the idea that if you go out and you talk to people early on in the process, and that if you give them a voice, they feel a sense of belonging. And I think most people in our society right now, especially as we're in this unraveling moment, they want that sense of purpose and belonging. So create public participation structures that actually further that early and as much as possible. And if we can do that, even when decisions, sometimes it's not perfect, you might not like it even, but if you feel like your voice has been heard, you may buy into it. And if you know that there's a bigger mission at play, a bigger sense of purpose and meaning that is infused into government through clarified missions and through agencies that have the capacity to listen to you and talk to you, respond to you, then I think we have an ability to move forward in, as Hannah said, that direction towards climate action where we address the climate crisis, but we also address the biodiversity crisis and we protect environmental justice. I'll leave it with a little bit of my own background. I had a video that I was going to show that didn't translate into the slides. I grew up on the Hudson River in New York, which was an industrial river. And I grew up literally right on the river. And across the river from me are all these state parks and then also a railroad right away. And so when I look across the river, it looks like a wilderness. It is not. It is the vestiges of huge industry and manufacturing, from ice to bricks, basically feeding downstream New York City. And when I paddle across there, as it looks like a wilderness, you get closer and closer and closer, you see all these old pylons and docks and manufacturing and industrial sites with trees threaded through them. And you see these lagoons that used to be for barges and other industrial ships that are now covered over in wetlands with blue heron and bald eagles and fish spawning. And it is amazing. And so as we do this work in the ruins, I hope we recognize that sense of possibility, that sense of liberation, and our ability to create something greater, true abundance. Thank you.
Yeah. This is such amazing insight. And Alvaro, we are looking to you to close us out, and I'm equally excited for what you will share with us. So Alvaro.
Thank you, Dana, and thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Alvaro Sanchez. I'm coming to you live from Mexico City, where I was born and visiting family. And I want to talk to you about some of the work that I've been doing recently. Recently I was asked what abundance means to me. And I said, it doesn't mean anything because that is not my mission. I'm working to build a new kind of economy, one that closes the wealth gap, accelerates climate action, and strengthens the communities we call home. But I get it, why abundance resonated among some liberals, progressive, and Democrats. And that's because it offers a clear path forward. And we need a clearly defined path forward now, because even though I vehemently disagree with Trump's mission, and to a much lesser extent, the abundance mission, they both offer a clear path forward that inspires and mobilizes large stakeholder groups, not just specialized groups. But what is our mission? The problem with having to talk so much about abundance when it is a very imperfect path forward is that we're not talking enough about what we want to do. We're not taking the time to articulate our vision of the future. And even more importantly, we're not taking the time to design an operational strategy on how to achieve it. Next slide, please. One more slide after this one. Thank you. I've been inspired by Mariana Mazzucato's Vision Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism, which advocates using bold, mission-oriented approaches like the Apollo moonshot to tackle complex societal changes by restructuring capitalism and harnessing the power of government, public-private collaboration, and innovation. Mazzucato calls for a fundamental rethinking of government's role in society, moving from market fixing to market shaping and actively directing capitalism towards inclusive and sustainable goals. She provides 5 criteria missions. These have helped me to describe a new path forward for California that colleagues and I are leading. A path that delivers broadly shared prosperity, economic resilience, and local community benefits while achieving California climate goals. First, missions need to be bold and inspirational. In my opinion, eliminating wealth inequality while solving the climate crisis and building the resilience of communities is the type of mission that many people can get behind. This isn't about abandoning regulation or lowering our climate ambitions. Strong standards remain essential, but we must pair them with equally ambitious economic policies that create good jobs, address affordability, reduce risk, and build thriving industries in every region of our state. We know that wealth inequality is driving so much of our problems today. California is both the fourth largest economy in the world and the most unequal state in the country. How can this be? The lack of affordability and economic opportunity that so many claim to be concerned with, including abundance advocates, is directly connected to the concentration of wealth and power that is baked into our economic system. If we don't tackle the concentration of power and wealth head on, we will not address the major challenges of our time. Second, missions need to have a clear direction. Missions require specific, measurable targets with clear timeframes to deliver focus and accountability. Leveraging government investments and the purchasing power of governments to shape markets as we fight climate change and build the resilience of our communities will lead to shared prosperity and help to tackle wealth inequality. In California, we're working towards delivering a comprehensive near and long-term policy playbook through cross-sector stakeholder convenings and technical research that will be ready on day one of the incoming governor in 2027. Third, missions need to be ambitious while realistic. This is where there is some overlap with the abundance advocates. Governments must continue to deliver what people need: housing, energy, food, transit, broadband. But they can do so with a mission-oriented mentality that strengthens civic infrastructure, government delivery capacity, and takes on concentrated wealth and power. Which is why in California, we're focusing on building up state and local development capacity with the scale and authority to match our ambitions. Whether through new cabinet-level agencies or dramatically strengthening coordination of existing programs, we must build government capacity to drive an economy-wide transition, not just regulate emissions. Fourth, missions must be cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary. Missions must mobilize expertise and resources across disciplines, sectors, and actors to catalyze systems-wide change. To achieve this goal, we are focusing on building broad coalitions and creating field infrastructure and capacity to sustain the work that we anticipate taking up to 10 years to at least see some progress being made. And finally, missions must drive multiple bottom-up solutions. Policies must be by and for the people affected, not simply delivered to them. Successful missions and movements are built when workers and communities have real agency in defining problems and crafting solutions. This is one of the core arguments of abundance, that there is simply too much process and that we need to get to implementation and delivery more quickly. But I'd argue that it is not the process that is the problem, but the lack of certainty about when the process ends, who gets to challenge it. And here I agree that we need to provide more certainty about what to expect from community engagement, about the timelines that we commit to, about the approval process that will be involved, and about committing to moving on to implementation and project delivery once the process has been completed. But if we want to have faith in project approvals that have gone through an approval process, we have to do a lot better driving up bottom-up solutions. We need to invest a lot more in sustaining the civic infrastructure needed to keep communities engaged and at the decision-making table. We continuously fail to invest enough time and capital on this core strategy, and it is to our own peril. Next slide, please. To wrap up my time, I want to talk about 5 actions that move us towards shared prosperity instead of abundance with an example. One of the most frustrating things about the abundance debate is that somehow, seemingly overnight, the message got out that community and the public sector can't do big things. It seems that now the only sector that can do big things is the private sector. And therefore, community and the public sector should just get out of the way. I completely disagree with that premise. In fact, I know we can get big things done because I've witnessed community and local government getting things done through the Transformative Climate Communities program, a program that provides catalytic investments to impacted communities to build housing, transit, renewable energy, all of the things a community decides and needs to become healthy, prosperous, and resilient. TCC centers local community leadership, requiring projects to be developed through collaborative governance between residents, community-based organizations, and local government, ensuring that decisions are driven by local needs, not imposed from above. To be honest, when I first proposed TCC as a concept, I worried a lot about delivering on its promise. I knew that construction is way too expensive. The projects can take forever to get built, and that there is often too many uncertainties involved that make things just plain harder than they should be. But the reason why infrastructure projects are hard is not simply because of red tape, regulatory protections, and opposition from stakeholders. It is more importantly difficult because we live in an economic system whose mission is to maximize profits at all costs and to concentrate prosperity with those that already have plenty of it. Because of my worries about successfully implementing TCC, I worked for years with community leaders in South Stockton, a community situated in California's northern Central Valley, to leverage TCC to address structural inequities, legacy disinvestments, and environmental justice. Through a new formation called Rise Stockton, community leaders harness broad community engagement to identify priorities resulting in the Sustainable Neighborhoods Plan, with strategies covering energy, health, parks, safety, transportation, waste, and water. Stockton was awarded $35 million in 2 TCC implementation grants, supplemented by $33 million in additional leverage funding. And thus far, outcomes of the project include 140 employment opportunities, youth apprenticeships, 40 reentry vocational trainees, 108 rooftop solar installations, 1,700 new trees, upgrades to major streets to make them complete streets with bike lanes, fixed sidewalks, and new canopy cover, and collaborative governance, reflecting a substantive power shift towards community ownership of development decisions. The Stockton TCC case highlights the power of bottom-up governance, capacity building, and formal structures for sharing decision-making authority and project benefits. It highlights that communities can get big things done without compromising process, centering community leadership, and working with the government as a mission-oriented partner, not just a referee or a safety net. Now, you might want to say that this can only happen in California because of the policy environment here and the field infrastructure that we have. But I believe that we have incredible civic infrastructure assets spread across all of the country that were developed in preparation for the Biden administration's infrastructure spending that are waiting to be reengaged and repurposed for a new mission. As we speak, state and local government leaders in many places are incubating policy ideas that will need strong civic partners to get those proposals approved and eventually to get them implemented. So if you take anything away from my comments today, is that we need to clearly communicate our mission and that we need to take the time to operationalize how we get there. I'm tired of feeling like we always have to respond to someone else's mission. I'm working to build a new kind of economy, one that creates wealth, that addresses the wealth gap, accelerates climate action, and strengthens the communities we call home. We can do this by doing everything we can to deliver the communities that we need today to be healthy, prosperous, and resilient, but with a mission-oriented mindset to change our economy so that we all share in the abundance our world already holds. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Alvaro. I heard a quote recently that said the compliment to critique is to create. And so that is a really powerful example. We have about 25 minutes to answer your questions. We wanted to make sure that we made space for that. So we will jump into it. There is a question from Basav, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, that asks, have abundance proponents been publicly challenged about highway construction injustices or about the proliferation of polluting facilities? Sorry, I don't know where the question went to. My apologies, everyone. Okay, we might have to come back to that one while I look for it. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Have abundance proponents been publicly challenged by these highway construction injustices or about the proliferation of polluting industry in Cancer Alley in Louisiana because of a permissive regulatory environment, and how do they respond? So I think this question is really about in places where it's been really tough for oversight and compliance, how is the abundance conversation showing up there? If anyone has an answer. Erik?
I mean, what I'll say is what I found is remarkable is that Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson is that they're actually a closed circle, that they're an echo chamber of pundits that are all talking to each other and to certain politicians, and that it seems strategic and tactical on their part to have ignored the critiques coming from the progressive left and to simply categorize all of us on the progressive left as, well, they're a bunch of NIMBYs and we don't need to pay attention to them. From my perspective, that is indicative that this is a power play to shift power or reduce the power of the progressive left and to concentrate power in more centrist voices and to have them make the decision. So this gets into, if people have been following it, the group's discourse on that front. So I think they're actively ignoring their critiques in order to center their own perspective. I think that has proven, frankly, effective in terms of them getting out there and being prominent on the scene. I think it also reveals a deep vulnerability that could collapse and endure backfire on them down the line. And I think that's our job.
Yeah.
We have been relentless fighting back against them, but I'm a dude living in northern New Mexico with way less than 2,000 followers on Blue Sky, and I gave up my Twitter account because it's a Nazi fascist cesspool. So it's difficult for us to punch a signal through the noise that they're creating, and I think they're very intentional about creating a noisy environment that silences us.
Yes, really, really powerful point. I did make a note earlier about how do we engage in the space in a way that our perspectives are heard more. Hannah, this question is for you. Do you think Ezra and Derek are concerned about how the arguments against their books are being used by libertarians and conservatives and maybe even moderate Dems to gut vital environmental protections? Is there any hope of opening their eyes and having them reframe their positions?
Oh, it's an excellent question. My job would be so much easier if I felt like I had any clear window into their minds. I can't say with any certainty that they feel on the defensive about the ways in which their ideas might be misconstrued. I do think something that's indicative, though, from a few years back, in one of Ezra Klein's opinion columns in the New York Times, he was sort of refuting Mark Andreessen, who he views as like the dark version of like his own political, ideological fellow, and was basically saying that like in regards to the Clean Air Act, to the Clean Water Act, that we've overcorrected. And he said, you can only say we've overcorrected because we did correct. But I thought that sort of framework of like we've overcorrected is really like myopic and misinformed when it comes to the like daily imperilment of ecosystems and the public's health and well-being. And I think that I would encourage folks who feel like they have a story to tell, who feel like there are things being overlooked by this kind of redundant rhetoric, to feel empowered to make your voices heard on that, because I do think there are so many powerful refutations of the idea that we have somehow course corrected or overcorrected and like don't need to pay sustained attention to environmental injustices today.
Yeah. The question says, it seems like the abundance agenda is really a broad messaging agenda, framing concept that other people, not communities, are defining policy around. And while many EJ orgs have engaged and developed deep expertise in policy development and advocacy, what can EJ orgs do now to engage in the messaging and narrative shaping efforts that can reframe these concepts through an equity lens? I think we started to answer this in some of what Erik and Hannah have talked about, but Alvaro, I'd be interested in how you would respond to this question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, my realization is that like, it's not like we're not doing the right things. I mean, especially environmental justice and equity organizations have been painting a vision of the future that looks very different than what we have now. But we just haven't been able to invest in both the design of that strategy and how to sustain that long-term work that we're going to have to be involved in to be able to like make the changes that we need to do. So across everywhere, not just among EJ and equity folks, today I'm talking about needing to like get back to basics, needing to like organize a lot more, needing to build coalitions, needing to be in communications with each other, to be able to like strategize and to be able to build trust. You know, a lot of what I've been able to see over the last year in California is that our field infrastructure, our coalitions, I mean, we're like experiencing the impacts that everyone is feeling kind of on a daily basis, but like that means a lot to our movement to be able to make the changes that we want to make. We are nowhere near the level of strength that we had in California among EJ and environmental equity organizations that we had just a few years ago. So we need to kind of get back to basis and be able to rebuild that and to be able to have the strength to be able to take on these powerful forces. So I would say, like, you know, what we have to reinvest in is our ability to organize, to strategize, to like vision together, to come up with the right language, and just to continue to root our work in the experiences of the people that are most impacted by all these things. And it's a slow burn. It's not an immediate pivot, but in fact, is the fact that we've moved away from the heart, like the principles of organizing and coalition building that have made us more susceptible, I think, now to these impacts that are heading our way. So it's not an easy answer because it takes a lot of commitment and investment. But I think needing to solidify our field and our capacity to sustain this work long term, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I see some nodding, Erik. You have some? Yeah, okay. I see a hand raised.
I don't know if there are funders on this, but I just want a shout out to funders to really put resources in play, especially for groups on the ground like We Act for Justice who are doing the organizing work. We win when we have boots on the ground, when we're having cups of coffee with people, when we're in the communities and understand their problems so that the solutions are in fact calibrated to what people are actually facing. That is precisely what we are in our wonky way trying to emphasize with an ecology of kinship and with eco-regional approaches that are bottom up in nature. In short, the solution isn't going to come from DC, it's going to come from the communities on the ground that organizers are in fact speaking with. So if you're a funder, build that long range, that long-term durable organizing capacity.
Yes. AJ, the examples that you shared were quite helpful. I wonder, though, how we respond to the examples of projects that really have been slow and costly, like the high-speed rail project in California. What is our analysis of what roadblocks can be removed so that projects can move forward? Some of the issues are eminent domain rules and a lack of public development capacity, over-reliance on for-profit developers.
Thanks, Dana. And yeah, I can't speak to like the state level in California specifically, but I will say for our NEPA Does Not Delay story map, we investigated a number of sources that kind of tried to pinpoint down the real root causes of delays when it comes to clean energy projects and transportation projects. And all the sources agreed that the three kind of key main problems are: one, a lack of funding and staffing, particularly specialized staff within the agencies that are responsible for NEPA implementation. Two is a lack of public participation. When you don't involve the community from the start and throughout the project, you are going to get pushback. You are going to get legal cases. And the third thing is a lack of interagency and intergovernmental coordination. So not just between the agencies responsible for NEPA implementation, but with tribal entities, for example, or coordination between state and federal government. And I will say there are a number of reasons as to why projects are being delayed, but I think the consensus is that the NEPA process, these environmental regulations, are not inherently delaying projects. For example, for some clean energy projects, some research has found that when developers find their projects are not economically viable anymore, they will just give up on the project. And that is another reason why clean energy is not being built out in our country.
Yeah, thank you. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the almost $1 billion of money in the Inflation Reduction Act that was earmarked to do the exact thing that you are talking about. How do we improve the systems and the processes and put people in place to be able to take a look at these projects and ensure that they move along in a meaningful way that we now no longer have access to. But our next question is, do we know why White House is pushing permitting reform? I'm going to toss that to Erik. I think my own personal opinion is that he has an ethos of wanting to work in a bipartisan way that I think that it doesn't feel like it's taken into consideration the political environment and dynamic that we are operating in. But Erik, I'll let you share some thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think it goes back to Senator Whitehouse and other politicians working within a pre-Trump frame and thinking that by legislating and doing that bipartisan work, you can somehow reach a good solution. And I think we're beyond that point, that I think we need more fundamental political change before we can entertain real permitting reform. I mean, it almost feels like, I mean, the House is out of session. Laws cannot be passed right now. We're dealing with everything else at the federal level. The government is literally being, the White House is literally being knocked down. And so I think in that context, I think a lot of folks are like, well, I do what I do because that's my job. And I think people need to think a bit more creatively, in particular politicians on that side of the equation. The other thing I'll emphasize on this front too is that our community's voice in DC has been severely weakened over the past 10, 15 years. When I talk to folks in DC, again, I live in northern New Mexico, so I'm not pounding the pavement on the Hill. I did do a tour of duty in DC, working for a national NGO, but our lobbying horsepower is far weaker than it has ever been. And so we're getting bulldozed by lobbyists, both from industry, fossil fuel industry, and tech industry, and then also by the abundance movement. And I think our movement has been marginalized, in part because the abundance movement itself has attacked the progressive left and sought to actively marginalize us. Again, I think that will ultimately backfire, but we are in a moment of deep vulnerability right now. So from a funding perspective, that's why I was emphasizing we need to build that on the ground capacity, that those loud voices that organizers can cultivate and cohere. That's why an organization like mine that historically has done an extraordinarily small amount of engagement at the federal level is working to build capacity to do that bottom-up work. We represent in a given year roughly around 200 NGOs, primarily community-based regional groups. And so trying to pull that together and serve as a hub where we can basically amplify that voice upwards to DC. So I think it's going to require a lot of investment in the NGO community, traditional environmental community, and then the EJ community to kind of build the capacity to have a voice in DC that I think right now is extraordinarily limited and frankly vulnerable and weak.
Yeah, very good points. From Gabrielle, given that it seems to be a constant uphill battle to implement the kind of regulatory changes at the state or federal level, do you see any value in developing parallel institutions and I'm not sure what that word is, so I'm just going to say districts for the purpose of, for these purposes, I'm sorry. Or if not, how does a small EJ nonprofit go about trying to work toward the kind of goals we're talking about today? Alvaro.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a super important question. Over the last year, I've been interviewing folks that pursued federal investment dollars to advance community priorities. And in my previous organization, I worked to build up development capacity in communities that were eager to take advantage of those resources. One of the things that I've learned is that the development capacity to take on this kind of change and kind of work on projects and go through the approval process, et cetera, to actively and genuinely engage in good process to assess whether a project is appropriate for a community or not, that development capacity is so low all over the place. It's low for government, it's low for communities, and it was done by design. I mean, like the defunding of government to do that function is by design. It allows the privatization of development and it kind of hands the keys over to that sector. So we need to dramatically invest in building up our development capacity. But something that we need to keep in mind is that in some places, we're probably going to have to innovate what that development capacity looks like, because it's too much of a burden to put that on a government or a community-based organization who is not quite equipped to take on that very challenging task of developing these kinds of projects. So we attempted through the Biden administration to turn a lot of places into developers that probably should not be thinking about doing that right now because their organizational capacity is just not there to be able to take on that really difficult task. But they do need development. So innovating on what that looks like, new formations, new institutions, new partnerships that provide development support without just saying we just have to rely on the private sector to hopefully come and develop for us, I think is something that is really getting in our way of both delivering the things that we need to get done in communities and being able to take advantage of things like the Biden administration infrastructure investments because we just were not ready to be able to develop, even though the dollars were at the table for people to take advantage of that.
Yeah. So Alvaro, I do see another question that was directed towards you. You were starting to answer. Did you want to answer out loud?
Oh, you mean the one that's on the chat?
Yeah, for Takashi.
Yeah, sure. So the question here is, what are some specific ways to put communities at the center of policy design while avoiding situations where communities organize to exclude others and prevent equitable housing development? How much local control is too much? Thinking about some places here in California. And I was, beginning to answer. Good question, super complex answer, because I think it has to do with holding a genuine and long-term dialogue between government and community. It may take a long time for a local community to come around and accept some of the development that, it would be really helpful for that community. But what I've seen over and over again is that engagement and that dialogue only happens when the proposal is already being kind of debated over whether it's going to be agreed on or not. So to Erik's point about sometimes you may not like the answer, but if you were genuinely involved in the process of coming up with that plan, that proposal, etc., you may accept it more. But ultimately, if a community is genuinely organized, and if a community is genuinely concerned about a development proposal and it doesn't happen, I think we have to kind of accept that. The community is coming together to say that. But the reason why I said it's complex is because the way that the system works now is that voices that have the resources, time, and capacity to inject themselves into the process are the ones that usually have the most sway over the process. It doesn't really reflect the community. It just reflects the people who are able and capable to engage in that process. And I think that this is why, to Erik and my point earlier, we have to severely invest in the ability of communities to organize and to engage in the process so that those decisions can be genuinely more reflective of the community that they're being made in. So
yes,
mushy answer, but I think that's all I got. And welcome my fellow panelists to help me here.
Okay. All right. I'm going to keep going really quickly. We have about 6 minutes left. Jennifer, this first step of having this webinar is how we wanted to start inviting people into a national conversation. And so you have given us something to think about. How do we keep this up? And so I say, stay tuned. We're going to figure something out. Hannah, you are a recently RIFT EPA employee in the Office of EJ and External Civil Rights. So many colleagues out of work, so much expertise. Have any of you thought about the possibility of rebuilding this office, also including others from nonprofit, state, and local community advocates as a new org and movement? I see some heads nod. So I saw Hannah's head nodding first. I saw Alvaro. So I don't know if people want to, and AJ, if people want to weigh in, or is there just an acknowledgement? Okay, I think we might just, sorry, Erik, yes.
I mean, I'll say that I love the idea of folks that were RIFT forming some kind of shadow entity, trying to do what their jobs are. I don't know if that involves a new organization or existing organizations trying to build that kind of capacity. There's always the risk of a proliferation of nonprofits, and we all think we're the best kind of thing. So figuring out ways that we can infuse that capacity into existing organizations. The work that I was mentioning before, what we're calling emergent horizons, like we're trying to build additional capacity within the organization. And if we're able to secure the funding for that, then we want to bring on positions. And I guarantee you we'll be looking for folks who are coming from the federal government. If you're an organization hiring right now, the pool is rich.
Yes.
There are so many amazing folks that are out there. So we just need more resources. So again, a pitch to funders to open up the spigots.
Yes. Absolutely.
This is the moment.
This is the moment. Sorry, go ahead.
And I think I was just going to say, and I feel like this is a moment to like really, in many places, we have to reinvent what government looks like. I mean, we've kind of just been stuck with a type of government that we are all kind of unhappy with. But there's so many of us that are working on civic innovation. And I think it's the right moment to start thinking like, what would it look like to have another agency who has a different mandate? And Erik mentioned earlier, sometimes agencies don't have like an explicit goal that they're trying to do. And I think kind of reimagining, like, what are these agencies, what is their mission? And how can we structure an agency to meet the moment of now? I think it's like that's a really good opportunity to be working on. And we need, a lot of really cross-sectoral thinking around like, how do we build these new institutions?
Yeah. Yes. Hannah, I'm going to direct this one to you. Do you think it's advantageous or disadvantageous to connect the defense of regulations to a broader redistribution message, as long as the benefits of development flow to many?
That's an interesting question. I'm such a visual reader that I need to find this.
Okay.
Is this under open questions?
Yeah, it's EHAB, if I have it right. Were you raising your hand, Erik? You have thoughts? Okay.
Ooh, okay.
Okay.
The defense. Yeah, I think this is it's an interesting point. I think that we do find ourselves defending imperfect systems. We find ourselves sort of on the back foot saying, well, yeah, like we need NEPA, even though like the procedures don't often get what we want. And that the answer with NEPA is so often not, no, this harmful project can't be built, but like, okay, well, this harmful project can be built, but like maybe with like these like sets of like mitigating design features attached to it, or like maybe it'll be like a slightly smaller parcel or, a slightly smaller time scale. So I think that the question of like whether we really want to be fighting that battle is a valid one. And I do think that as Erik and as Alvaro and others have spoken about, while we are at work in the ruins, we have this opportunity to try and sort of re-articulate a more substantive and more comprehensive vision of like what we would like to see, where we want development to come from and what we want it to be for. And I would encourage all of us to not fall back on the defense of what is at the cost of envisioning what could be. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it was a beautiful answer. I saw you lean forward, Alvaro, but I think it brought us to 2:30 p.m., a really powerful way to end. Did you have your hand up, AJ, and I missed it?
Yeah, if I could just quickly answer the last question, I'll go really briefly. I will say that when we talk to environmental justice communities, they do say that federal regulations, state regulations, sometimes are not perfect. A lot of times are not perfect, and they do need to go further. A lot of the work that EJ groups did during the Biden-Harris administration was pushing the administration to do stronger rulemakings from the EPA and other agencies. So that is definitely work that I think EJ groups will continue to do regardless of administration.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. I know there are additional powerful comments in the chat that we appreciate. And we look forward to continuing this conversation and sharing information with you. Our email addresses are on the screen now, and you can expect to get a follow-up that will have the recording, that will have slides, and that will have the next steps and other resources that were dropped in the chat. Thank you.